The Houston Rockets are one of the most underrated franchises in the NBA. The Rockets' 58-season existence has spanned across 2 cities, with 2 championships, 3 MVPs, Hakeem Olajuwon, the greatest shot blocker ever, James Harden, one of the greatest offensive engines, and Moses Malone, one of the best rebounders, with multiple legitimately great eras of basketball. But start from the very beginning, before they were ever even in Houston. The San Diego Rockets were introduced as the NBA's 12th team, starting in 1967, but immediately got off to a rough start, losing a league record 67 games in their inaugural season. But over the offseason, they would draft Elvin Hayes with the first pick. Hayes would average 28 and 17 in his rookie year. Along with Don Kojic, the Rockets would sneak into the playoffs and make a competitive series with the Hawks. Over the next 2 seasons, the Rockets would continue to build a young core, adding Calvin Murphy, Rudy Tomjanovich, and Stu Lance, but things would quickly change. Over the next 5 years, the Rockets wouldn't make the playoffs, starting their first 7 seasons without a 500 or better record. And in that time span, the Rockets would move to Houston under new owner Billy Goldberg and would trade Elvin Hayes to the Bolts. It was a disastrous start to a new franchise in a struggling league without consecutive champions for the last 6 years, and though the Rockets were competitive in 1975 and 1976, everything would change in the 1976-77 season. The Rockets would trade up for the first pick, drafting John Lucas, and later in that season, Houston would trade for 21-year-old Moses Malone. And in that first season with Malone and new coach Tom Nasalki, Houston would win a then franchise-high 49 games, and do even better in the playoffs, with their second playoff series victory, beating the Bullets in 6 before losing to the 76ers in the conference finals, but an encouraging season. Unfortunately, the next year is much worse, with one of the scariest moments in NBA history. In the pre-1980s NBA, there were fights all the time, as the NBA was barely televised and much scrappier than even the 80s and 90s, and in a fight between Lakers Kermit Washington and Rockets Kevin Garnett, Washington would lead in a clean punch on Rudy Tomjanovich, resulting in a ton of fractures across his face, and at times they would fear of life-threatening injuries. Tomjanovich would return later that season, but the Rockets couldn't recover, winning just 28 games. But next season the Rockets would return to the playoffs, with the addition of Rick Barry and Moses Malone winning MVP, but would get knocked out in the first round to the Hawks. It would be the same story in 1980, making the playoffs with a great year from Malone, but another early exit from Houston, and it would appear the same way in 1981. Malone finished 4th in MVP, but the Rockets won just 40 games and snuck into the playoffs. In the first round, Houston would sneak past the Lakers and Kareem, and in the second round, a Calvin Murphy Game 7 masterclass of 42 points on 19 for 28 from the field would be just enough to come back against the George Gervin Spurs. Moses Malone and Calvin Murphy would run through the Kansas City Kings to finally give Houston their first finals appearance after multiple conference finals defeats, and they would even split the first 4 games with Boston, but the Cinderella story would end here, and it would be the highest Houston would get for a while. The Celtics would dominate Game 5 and pull away in the second half in the deciding Game 6, and even with Moses Malone winning his second MVP of his career the next season, with a career-high 31 points a night, the Rockets would lose in the first round, and with Malone's contract talks approaching, the Rockets would trade him to Philly. But when one all-time great big man leaves, a better one somehow appears. In the 1984 draft, the Rockets would pass on Michael Jordan, a move that should be franchise-ruining, but they would instead draft Hakeem Olajuwon, a nice consolation prize for missing MJ. Olajuwon, paired up with 24-year-old All-Star Ralph Sampson, will make the Rockets a playoff team in Olajuwon's rookie season, one that he averaged 20.5 points, 12 rebounds, and 2.7 blocks, while making an All-Star team and finishing 12th in MVP voting. But the next season they would somehow get even better, with Houston winning 51 games and Hakeem taking the reign of the squad, finishing 4th in MVP voting, and in the playoffs they couldn't be stopped. Houston would sweep Sacramento in the first round before winning a hard-fought 6-game series against the Nuggets, but they wouldn't appear as hopeful to start the conference finals, losing the first game by 12 to a 62-win Lakers squad who had Magic and Kareem, both finishing top 5 in MVP voting and All-NBA first-teamers, and had won the West the last 4 seasons, with 2 championships in that span, including last year. No way a second-year Hakeem and very young Rockets team could come back and beat one of the greatest dynasties ever.
Turn up, Gino.
Hakeem averaging 32, 10, and 4 blocks in them, and comeback wins in Game 3, 4, and 5, capped off with a Ralph Sampson buzzer beater to send Houston to the NBA Finals. They would be defeated by Boston once there, but they made a competitive series with one of the greatest teams of all time in the 1986 Celtics, but unfortunately, just like the Rockets' last Finals appearance, things would get much worse very quick. The Rockets would start the next year very slowly, with an injury to co-star Ralph Sampson, and though the Rockets would sneak into the playoffs and somehow even win a series against Clyde Drexler and the Blazers, they would be eliminated in the next round despite a historic Game 6 from Kareem. The next half-decade would be incredibly boring, as with a trade sending Sampson to Golden State, the Rockets would continually waste Olajuwon's prime. As though he would be a consistent all-NBA level player and DPOY candidate, Houston would surround him with lackluster supporting casts, and they would lose in the first round in 4 straight years, before missing the playoffs entirely in 1992. But in the next season, there would be some hope. The Rockets would improve on their record by 13 wins, finishing with 55 total under first-year full-time head coach Rudy Tomjanovich. And Hakeem would win his coveted first Defensive Player of the Year with a league-leading 4.2 blocks per game, and in the playoffs they would win their first series in 7 years off a dominant Game 5 by Hakeem, before devastatingly falling to Seattle in a Game 7 overtime loss. And while that loss hurt, the potential was there, especially with Michael Jordan's sudden retirement, and with new owner Leslie Alexander, the 1994 season would be legendary. Hakeem Olajuwon would finally win his first MVP and get his second consecutive DPOY en route to a franchise record 58 wins. They would quickly beat Portland in the first round before coming down from 2-0 against Phoenix in the second round off of, you guessed it, another insane Hakeem elimination game. He would again outmatch another historic big, this time being Utah Jazz and Karl Malone, and Houston would make it back to their third finals, but to start off the series, it looked like the same story as the previous 2 times. The Knicks took a 3-2 lead, and with the possibility of Hakeem losing his and the Rockets' best chance at a title, this is where his time came. Just as they had done before, the Rockets would come up big when it mattered, with clutch wins in Games 6 and 7 as the Rockets had finally done it. Hakeem would become the first player in NBA history to win MVP, Finals MVP, and DPOY in the same season, and this run cemented his status as an all-time great. But the momentum wouldn't carry over to the next season, and it looked like it would just be yet another disappointing season after a Finals appearance, winning just 47 games and finishing as the 6th seed despite the midseason accusation of an aging Clyde Drexler. But what was to come in that playoff run was nothing short of a miracle. This run shouldn't have been possible. The 47-win Rockets were massive underdogs in every series and had to battle adversity on every stop, coming from down 2-1 against the Jazz, down 3-1 against the Suns, and tied 2-2 against the Spurs. In the first 3 rounds of their closeout games, they were all decided by 5 or fewer points, and they were so good in close games across the last 2 title runs that they drew the nickname Clutch City. They were the first team to ever come back from down 2-0 and 3-1 in a playoff series, the lowest seeded champion ever, and Olajuwon became the second player to win Finals MVP in back-to-back years. In the next season, he would break the all-time blocks record, as he still dominantly sits across the leaderboard, but they would get swept in the second round, prompting the Rockets to trade for a 33-year-old Charles Barkley, and their experiment didn't look too bad at first, with 57 wins off their 3 All-Stars and a conference finals appearance, but the Jazz would get their revenge, beating them in 6, and in the following season, an injury-plagued Rocket squad would limp into the playoffs before losing to a finals-bound Utah team yet again. Clyde Drexler would retire in the offseason, and even with the addition of Scottie Pippen, Houston would fall in the first round again. The next couple of off-seasons would be a roller coaster of emotions. In the summer of 1999, the Rockets would trade up for Steve Francis, but Scottie Pippen would be traded away due to chemistry issues with Charles Barkley, who would later suffer a career-ending injury as Houston would miss the playoffs for the first time in 8 years and lose 48 games, the most since 1984. Despite a bounce-back 45 wins the next year, the Rockets would miss the playoffs and would follow Hakeem's trade request, trading him to Toronto for the final year of his career, officially the end of an era as the franchise's GOAT was gone and it was time to undergo a complete rebuild. Hey, thank you so much for making it this far in the video. It already helps out a ton, but if you are enjoying, if you could subscribe or like the video, it helps me and future videos out tremendously. But let's get back into it. But somehow, just like in the early 1980s, when one all-time big man leaves, another arrives, and the Rockets would be awarded the first overall pick in the 2002 draft, taking 7'6" center Yao Ming. And with 2 All-Stars in Yao and Francis, the Rockets would become a playoff-level team, winning 43 games in 2003 and 45 in 2004, breaking a 5-year playoff-less streak, with Yao panning out into a star, his size being perfect in the dead ball era, and his post-game vision ahead of his time for a player that big. And in the offseason, they would make a huge move, trading a combination of players, including Steve Francis, for 25-year-old Tracy McGrady, and in that 04-05 season, the Rockets got even better. Houston would win 51 games with T-Mac averaging 26, 6, and 6, finishing 7th in MVP voting. But things would fall apart in the playoffs, as the Rockets would take a 2-0 lead, and even after a 3-game collapse, they forced a Game 7, one in which the Rockets would lose by 40, shooting just 35% from the field and 17% from 3, and players not called Tracy McGrady or Yao Ming scored just 16 points on 6 for 33 shooting. Next year would just be worse, as Yao Ming would start to show how injury-plagued he really was, missing 25 games while co-star McGrady missed 35, as Houston would win just 34 games, with the second lowest offensive rating in the league. 2007 would be a similar story to 2005, making the playoffs with 52 wins as T-Mac would finish 6th in MVP voting, and Houston would get a 2-0 lead in the first round, but again choked, scoring just 82 points in Game 6, and just by battling in Game 7 and even tying the game multiple times late, the Rockets would falter late. Yao Ming would suffer a season-ending injury in February 2008, but the Rockets would end their season on fire, winning 22 straight between late January and mid-March, and would finish with 55 wins, but yet again in the playoffs, losing the first round to the Jazz for the second consecutive season. The Rockets would add Ron Artest in the offseason, but injuries to the big 3 of Artest, McGrady, and Yao would take away many opportunities to see them play together, and the latter missing the playoffs with a knee injury, but they would win 53 games, and for the first time in over a decade, win a playoff series. In the second round, Houston would go band for band with the Lakers, taking them to 7, but Yao would get injured, and Pau Gasol had a monster game, eliminating the Rockets in the second round, and the last we would see of Dikembe Mutombo, who had been riding out his final years with Houston, and the next year would be a disaster. Yao's injury against the Lakers would carry over, as he wouldn't play a second. Ron Artest would leave over the offseason, and Tracy McGrady would be traded at the deadline. Aaron Brooks would win Most Improved Player, and the end of the season play from recently acquired Kevin Martin would help Houston, but they would finish with 42 wins, somehow 8 back of what was needed for a playoff appearance in the West. In 2011, the Rockets would make a late surge at the playoff spot, winning 15 of 20 after trading for Goran Dragic, but would lose some key games down the stretch, and with 43 wins, would miss the playoffs the second consecutive season, as Rockets legend Yao Ming would also retire that summer. The Rockets would again miss the playoffs with a record above 500 in 2012, but moves over the last couple years and in that offseason would make some interesting changes to their roster, like letting Dragic walk and trading Lowry, before they would stumble upon their next franchise player. In the 2012 offseason, the Western Conference champion Oklahoma City Thunder were unwilling to give six-man James Harden the extra $4 million that he requested, leading to the Beard being shipped to Houston, along with a couple end-of-bench guys for Kevin Martin, Jeremy Lamb, and a couple first-rounders, a deal that immediately worked out. In his Rockets debut, he would score 37 of 12 assists, and 2 days later, a then career-high 45 points. The Rockets would surprisingly win 45 games, and though they lost in the first round to Harden's old squad, it was a huge step forward for Houston, as they had found their franchise player in Harden, who had made an All-Star and All-NBA team in just his first season as a Rocket. And in the offseason, the Rockets would continue their trend of acquiring stars for their main guy, signing Dwight Howard to a 4-year deal, giving Harden a big man to work with. And along with Jeremy Lin, Chandler Parsons, and Patrick Beverley, this team was projected to compete for the Western title. The Rockets would win 54 games, and though Harden would take another step, this year making an All-NBA first team and finishing top 5 in MVP voting, the playoffs were a different story. Harden would shoot just 37.6% from the field and below 30% from 3, with Dame hitting a buzzer beater to knock Houston out in round 1. But Harden would put the team on his back next year. There would be plenty of roster turnover with the loss of Jeremy Lin and Chandler Parsons, addition of Trevor Ariza, and injury of Dwight Howard. But one thing would remain consistent all year, that being Harden, who played all but one game, averaging 27, 7, and 6 with his first 50-pointers and finished second in MVP voting with 25 of the 130 first-place votes, and the Rockets got 56 wins, the most in 18 years. In the first round, Houston would match up against in-state rival Dallas and make quick work of them with a gentleman sweep. They wouldn't win 50 games again in 7 years after that series. But in the second round, it would look much worse, with the Rockets having a 3-1 deficit. But as a unit, they would show their resiliency, highlighted in their Game 6 comeback, where Houston would win the fourth quarter 40-15 off of Corey Brewer and Josh Smith to stay alive. This would be the Rockets' first conference finals in 18 years, but disappointingly, it would be a sudden loss. Despite Harden's 45 in Game 4, and the 2015-16 season would be one to forget. An offseason trade for Ty Lawson added on to expectations, but they were not met, finishing at 500 with the early season coaching change. Harden was given even more of an offensive burden, and it turned him becoming one of the most inefficient players in the league. And though they would sneak into the playoffs, it would be a 5-game loss in round 1 against Golden State. But in the 2016 offseason, this team would fully lean into their identity. Howard would leave in free agency, but Harden would re-sign with a 4-year extension. They would bring in new head coach Mike D'Antoni and sign 2 perimeter players, Eric Gordon and Ryan Anderson, and in the regular season, everything seemed great. Houston's offensive rating jumped from 108.3 to 114.7. D'Antoni was the coach of the year, Gordon was 6th man of the year, Harden was second in MVP voting, and they would win 55 games, a 14-win leap. Even to start the playoffs, it would be great. MVP Russ and runner-up Harden going toe-to-toe. The Rockets supporting cast came up big, as Houston would win in 5, but the next series would be a huge disappointment. The 61-win Spurs were just too much, blocking Harden at the end of regulation in Game 5, and a dominant closeout Game 6 win with Nene out, before one of the biggest offseasons in Rockets history. Chris Paul would be traded to Houston, giving them the best chance out of anyone with the Cavs-Kyrie IT deal to beat the Warriors, but was a heavily criticized deal when it occurred. There would also be a change in ownership, with Tillman Fertitta buying the Rockets for $2.2 billion from Leslie Alexander. And in the 2018 season, it would be one of the most craziest in recent memory for the Houston. They would win a league-leading and franchise-high 65 wins, which had a 17-game win streak involved, and ended up with the first seed over Golden State. Harden would finally get that illustrious MVP with 30 points and 9 assists, and though Chris Paul would miss a stretch throughout the year, the duo of Harden and Paul worked perfectly. If one of them needed to get a bucket, they can do so at will, and also relieve ball handling pressure, so when they have the ball, they are better with it. They took care of business in the first 2 rounds, beating the Wolves and Jazz in 5, before matching up with the Warriors, and it would be one of the best conference finals of the decade. 27 straight missed threes. A complete statistical anomaly, combined with blatant ref ball and the injury of Chris Paul, was just enough for the Warriors to knock off Houston, and that would be the best team they would put together. The chemistry of Paul and Harden would shatter during the 2019 season, and though they would win 53 games and Harden averaged 36 points, they never had a shot in the West, losing to the Warriors again, this time in the second round. The Rockets would try trading for Russell Westbrook to pair next to the Beard. Instead of Paul, they went ultra small ball, but when matched up against Anthony Davis in the bubble, it was an embarrassing loss in the second round, and by the start of the 2020-21 season, Harden had requested and received a trade to the Brooklyn Nets. The next couple years would be rough, winning a combined 59 games from the 2021 to 22-23 seasons, but over time they would quietly build a young core. Last season, they came out of nowhere to win 41 games and get into the play-in discussions with a deep team, including younger guys like Alperen Sengun, Jalen Green, Amen Thompson, Tari Eason, Jabari Smith Jr., Cam Whitmore, and now Reed Shepherd. Currently, Houston sits at 15-6 and second in the West and have one of the brightest futures in the league. If you want to buy stock into a team, do it to Houston right now. If you made it this far, thank you so much. Just made a second channel, by the way, where I'll make more common videos. So this channel is going to be maybe a couple videos a month, 20 plus 15-minute long videos like this. The other channel is going to be videos every couple days about just basketball, the NBA. The last video is about Jokic. Next video is going to be out about recapping the play-in tournament, which should be out Wednesday night, maybe Thursday morning, depending on how long it takes. But thank you so much for watching the video. Subscribe if you like it. I know I already asked. And yeah, I'll see you next time.